Welcome back to Train Signal. This is Elias Kinaser and you're watching Installing the Hyper-V Role on Windows Server 2012. Alright, so I promised you in the last lesson that this lesson will not contain a lot of PowerPoint. I have one slide. This is it. So what are we going to do? Well, we are going to prepare the host for the Hyper-V Role installation, and as part of that preparation we're going to install two features before we actually install the role. Those features are the failover clustering and the multipath I/O. Now the failover clustering you don't really have to install. It's not kind of a prerequisite. If you wait until the next lesson where we're installing Virtual Machine Manager, and as you're dragging or as you're adding a host to the cluster, it's automatically going to add this feature because it's a prerequisite. But what I'm trying to do here is show you what VMM is automating for you, what's happening kind of behind the covers so that you know what's going on. So we're going to enable the failover clustering. We're also going to enable multipath I/O, multipath input-output. And this is useful as you're using shared storage, a SAN, iSCSI, NAS, or Fiber Channel, to have more than one path to that storage. So that if one path fails, you're not getting a denial of service. You have another path of reaching the storage. So you're providing for redundancy, for high availability, for fault tolerance, etc., etc. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I don't want to spend too much time on this slide. We're also going to talk about the networking aspects of the Hyper-V, what we're configuring, how we're going to configure it, how many NICs am I using, virtual, physical, etc. We're then going to spend some time on configuring the shared storage, making it available, creating a quorum disk, showing you how I'm adding LUNs. We'll talk a little bit about the storage that I'm using here, which is the Starwind iSCSI SAN. And again, this would be a good time for you if you haven't built your lab yet and you want to know what I'm using for this entire course. I invite you to go watch the Getting Started lesson as I'm listing out what my lab kind of looks like, what software I'm using, what hardware I'm using, so that'll kind of help you follow along here with these steps. But I want to spend some time on the Storage Management Initiative Specification, otherwise known as SMIS. Microsoft has standardized on this initiative, on this standard, and is actually actively participating in the development of this, industry standard for lack of better terms. So what does it do? Think of SMIS as a storage virtualization technology. So today what happens is when you buy a NetApp or an EMC or a Hitachi or an IBM or a Dell or an HP, each one of them is going to come with its own management console that can manage their own hardware. Well, the SMIS standard or specification is aiming at, simplifying this complexity. Why do I need all these management consoles? Why can't I sort of have a single entity that can centrally manage all of this hardware without losing any of the underlying features? So for instance, in the case of Microsoft here, the storage manufacturer, in my case Starwind, has a provider. Think of the provider as a plugin for System Center, right? That you can upload into System Center that would then allow the virtual machine manager to control the underlying hardware without necessarily having to use their own management console. Now, why is this important in a private cloud? Why is this important in a Microsoft private cloud, and why did they choose the SMIS standard? Well, the idea behind the private cloud, if you go back to some of the stuff that we've been talking about, is that things need to happen automatically. I'm talking about automation and orchestration. The application at some point might need to provision its own storage. In order to enable that automation and orchestration, we have to be able to enable Virtual Machine Manager to make these calls, to make these requests, to provision the hardware, to provision the software. Well, and that's where it comes in. If you're able to kind of create that standard, and the manufacturers create these providers that expose the features of their hardware or software, well then Virtual Machine Manager or others will be able to control it. And there lies the importance of the Storage Management Initiative Specification, otherwise known as SMIS. I think that's enough talking. Let's go ahead and log in and prepare the server, install the Hyper-V role, and have some fun. Alright, so we've logged on to our Hyper-V 01 server. Now, a few things before we get started. If you've been following along with my other courses, you'll know that I always put or rename the My Computer icon on the desktop with the name of the server that we're currently logged into. This makes it easy for you to identify the server as we are jumping from server to server. So right now we're on Hyper-V 01. The other thing I want to bring to your attention, because I'm RDP'd into the server, and because this is Windows Server 2012 and I constantly have to go up here to the right in order to get this menu to show up, you're going to notice that the RDP bar here is always going to also come up. I don't want that to distract you, and this is essentially showing you the IP address of the server that I'm currently logged into. Now that being said, let's go ahead and show you what I've done on this server so far. I've done some preparatory things that I want you to be aware of. So for starters, let's go ahead and launch Server Manager. And if I go here to a local server, you'll notice that one of the things that I've done is I've disabled the Internet Explorer Enhanced Security Configuration. And to do that, you simply just click on the on here if it's off, and you just turn it off if you want to follow along with exactly what I'm doing. Now the other thing that I want to show you before we actually start installing anything is I want to bring up my current network adapter settings so that you guys can see what I have today and what we're trying to do. So if I bring this up and we go to change adapters here, I have this current configuration. So what I've done is I've added 4 physical NICs to this server. Now keep in mind, because we are building all of our environment and virtual, and even these Hyper-V hosts are virtual. These are technically 4 virtual hosts, but as of right now I want to start referring to those as physical NICs, right? So these are not virtual NICs anymore. I want you to think of them as physical NICs because it can get confusing as we're starting to go into some nested VMs and stuff like that. So think of those as your physical NICs in an actual server. What I've done is I have 4 of them, and we've configured them in a specific way. So I have one dedicated for storage, and if I right click on it, go down here to properties, you'll notice that if we take a look at the IP configuration, I have this in a specific subnet. So I've isolated my IP storage traffic on the 192.168.3.1. So this is the IP address of this particular NIC. Hyper-V2 will be 3.2, Hyper-V3 will be 3.3. I've given it a subnet mask, I have not given it a default gateway, and I have not given it any kind of DNS configuration. And I've done the same thing for the cluster. Let me show you the cluster as well. Right click, we're going to go down here to properties, and if we go in here, you'll see that the cluster is also isolated on its own subnet, and that's subnet 4. And again, 4.1 for Hyper-V1, 4.2, 4.3 for the other hosts. Subnet, no default gateway, no DNS. Now, the reason for no DNS is, again, if you point this particular NIC essentially to a DNS server, it's going to register the server name with this NIC. So as your clients are requesting access to resources or information off of the server, it could get confusing because this isn't, it's going to be responding back or replying back with an incorrect IP address that is not designed to reply with any of the information that the user or the client is asking for. So we're going to click on cancel, and we're going to click on cancel here. Now you'll notice that the management console or the management NIC, if I right click on it, come down here to properties, this is the one that's routable, right? So this is the one that's fully populated. This is the IP of my server, which you saw on the RDP bar as well. My subnet mask, my gateway. I have a domain controller that's acting as my DNS server called dc01.wiredbraincoffee.com, and I have given it a secondary DNS server as well. So this is my routable network. We're going to click on cancel here, and then we're going to click on cancel here as well. Now Ethernet 2 VM, this is my VM network. This is what when we add the Hyper-V role, and during the process it's going to request, well, which interface do you want the virtual machines that are connected to your switch to communicate through in order to gain access to the external world. So I've added this network interface card, but I have not given it any kind of an IP address because this is essentially going to become that interface that the layer 2 virtual switch is going to use to pass the information out to the external world. So don't touch it, leave it alone. We're not going to configure it with anything. I'm going to show you what I do want to show you is what it looks like today before we have added this as the interface for the virtual switch, and you'll see after we add the Hyper-V role how some of these things are going to change here so that it becomes that interface. So I'm going to go ahead and click on cancel. Now one thing I do want to show you before we move on is the binding order for these interfaces matters a lot. And what I mean by that is if you go to the advanced button up here and you scroll down to advanced settings, you'll see that my binding order is all over the place. So what I want to do is I want to select management. I want to make that my very first binding. VM should be the second one. I'm going to make storage the third, and then clustering. So what this does essentially from a binding order perspective, anytime this host wants to send something out, it's going to send it out first via that management interface. So the management interface is getting an elevated standing, if I could call it, within this host, so that as you're receiving something, the management interface is getting that first shot at it, and as you're sending something, that management interface is becoming that central focal point. This will avoid a lot of latency back and forth with your server, so I highly recommend that you configure it this way. Once you click on OK, the other thing that I want to draw your attention to is you have to be familiar with the device names here. Those are going to be very important as you start to manage your Hyper-V host from within the Hyper-V Manager. If you're trying to create other virtual hosts, you'll see that these names will not appear, and I'll show you once we install the Hyper-V role what I mean by that. So you'll have to know which one of these labels correlates to which one of these actual device names so that you can configure this properly. So it's important here that you make that mental note, and as you're configuring Hyper-V, you can come back here and figure out, kind of which one correlates to which one. You'll see that from a connectivity perspective, the storage and cluster have no connectivity, whereas my management and my virtual machine network are the only two routable networks at this point. So with that said, let's go ahead and get out of here. I'm going to close this out as well, and let's go back into Server Manager. The first thing I want to do is install the failover clustering and the multipath I/O. So to do that, we're going to click on Add Roles and Features. We're going to click on Next to get past the original screen, and here it's essentially saying, are you installing these role-based features or feature-based installation, or are you doing a remote desktop services installation? We're going to go with Roles and Features. We're going to click on Next. I'm applying this against this particular server, Hyper-V01. So we're going to click on Next here. And these are the roles. I'm not going to install Hyper-V just yet. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Next to get to the Features screen. And on the Features screen, what I want to select is Failover Clustering. It's going to prompt me with the interdependencies for that particular feature. I'm going to accept them. Then I'm going to scroll down a little bit here to where I can find Multipath I/O. There it is. Now, multipath I/O again, and to emphasize this, you need this particular driver, call it, because you want to have more than one path to your storage. If you have a single path to your storage, then that's a single point of failure, especially if you're doing IP storage like I am in the form of iSCSI. Multipath I/O allows you to have more than one path, probably more than one interface connecting to that storage array. So if that one of them fails, you have another access point to it. And the other reason you can do that is for load balancing, for round robin. There's 100 reasons why multipath I/O makes a lot of sense. Now, in the next lesson, when we install VMM will not automatically install multipath I/O for you. However, if you didn't want to install the failover clustering feature here, VMM will do that for you. Now, once I'm ready, I'm going to go ahead and click on Next, and then I'm going to click on Install. Once it's done, we're going to go ahead and click on Close, and you'll see up here that it is giving me a notification, and that notification basically says that the installation was successful on this particular server. Alright, now let's take a look at what I've got here now in my Start menu, in my new Start menu. So if I click on it, you'll see that I have the Failover Cluster Manager that's been added. This is also available through Administrative Tools. So is the Multipath I/O console that's also available through the Administrative Tools. I'm not going to touch the failover clustering features, but I do want to go into Multipath I/O and show you something real quick. So if you click on the DSM install tab here, what you'll find is that every SAN provider could possibly give you a DSM driver. DSM stands for Device Specific Modules. What the device specific modules will do is they will optimize that multipath I/O. So for instance, some device specific modules have the tendency to do better load balancing because they have that algorithm built in. Some of them will give you the option of doing round robin. Others might use a single path until that path fails, and then it'll fail over to another path which is in standby. So there's different ways of configuring multipath I/O depending on the capabilities of your shared storage and the provider, what they're giving you in the form of a DSM, and that's essentially a driver that you can load in. For my purposes, for the Starwind SAN that I'm using, I'm just going to use the basic default Microsoft DSM, so I'm not loading anything in particular. But depending on what you're using within your environment, depending on the type of storage that you're using, if there is a DSM, then this is where you can come in and install it. So I'm going to go ahead and click on cancel now. And now that we've installed the features that are required, what I want to do now is we're going to install the Hyper-V role. Now to do that, we're going to click on add roles and features again. We're going to go through the same screen, so I'm not going to bore you with these details. And then we're going to find Hyper-V. These are the prerequisites for Hyper-V. I'm going to go ahead and click on add features. Then we're going to click on next. We're going to get past the features. We're not adding anything here. We're going to click on next again. Now this is where you're configuring that virtual machine network. Remember when I showed you those NICs and told you, at some point during the Hyper-V role installation, it's going to prompt you to select one interface to become that interface for the virtual machine network. Now I've named them appropriately, so it's kind of easy for me to find them here. Now this is not the case in Hyper-V Manager. In Hyper-V Manager you'll see that these don't show up, and the only thing that you see is a description or the device names as such. So for now I'm going to select Ethernet VM. We're going to click on next. Do I want to allow live migration? Yes, I do want to do that. And you can go ahead and go with Kerberos if that's the standard that you're using in your environment. Kerberos is obviously more secure. It's also a little more complicated to configure. For the purposes of my demonstration, I'm just going to go with Credential Security Support Provider. So I'm just going to go with the default and click on next. This is the default location of where it's going to put the hard drives and also the configuration files for the virtual machines. I'm going to keep them at defaults for now. Click on next. Do you want to restart automatically? I'd like to restart my server myself, so I'm just going to go ahead and click on install at this point and let the installation begin. As you can see, the installation of the Hyper-V role is fairly straightforward. There's really nothing there. Once this is completed, we're going to have to give the server a reboot, and once the reboot is complete, the server is going to come up. Now, one thing that I also neglected to mention to you, that I've already added this host to the domain wiredbraincoffee.com. So I've done that as a preparatory measure as well at the beginning. So if you're trying to follow along, again, make sure you're adding this particular host to the domain. Now that this is completed, we're going to go ahead and click on close, and I'm also going to give the server a reboot. And then we're going to come back and take a look at the physical NIC settings of this host and take a look at what's changed. And we're back. Let's take a look at what happened from a physical NICs perspective. So we're going to go to control panel here real quick, and we're going to bring up those adapters again. And let's take a look in particular at the VM interface. So if I right click on it and go to properties, you'll find that it's very different now. So right now it is serving as the Hyper-V extensible virtual switch. So essentially it's serving as the interface for that layer 2 virtual switch that Hyper-V created. So you see everything else is kind of unchecked, as opposed to if you look at the management network here, you see it's very, very different, right? So if I click on cancel now, you'll also see that I have a new addition to the family. That's the Ethernet, and you'll see that it's connected to this particular device number 3, right? So you see that this device number 3 here this is the virtual switch essentially that Hyper-V created and then connected to this particular interface. So if you see that this device here correlates exactly to this one here. So you see how that link is happening. Now let me also show you what I was talking about from the fact that the device names are very important here. So let's go ahead and get out of here and let's go into Hyper-V Manager. Now this should look familiar. This is just a traditional Hyper-V Manager console here. Nothing has changed. If you're not familiar with Hyper-V a lot, I highly recommend you check out Train Signal for some Hyper-V 2008 R2 and Hyper-V 2012 training. Now, one thing I do want to stress is that in this course, we're not going to spend a lot of time on Hyper-V. This is probably the only lesson where you're seeing any significant amount of work being done in Hyper-V. Now, Hyper-V is very important in the Microsoft private cloud. It is that layer that does all the execution. But for this particular course, the focus and the emphasis is going to be more on Virtual Machine Manager and all of the subcomponents that live within its world. Hyper-V, again, this is probably the only lesson where we're going to take a look at it. But if you select the Hyper-V host that you have here, and then on the right you come into Virtual Switch Manager, you'll see that my virtual switch, the one that it automatically created during the Hyper-V role installation, is currently associated with this particular NIC. Now, if you're creating a new virtual switch, your options would be to select one of these physical interfaces. You see how complicated this becomes? It's not giving you the actual friendly label that we created to identify these devices. So pay attention here and make sure you know how to go back and figure out which one is which. Otherwise, it's a little complicated, and I was really hoping that this would change, but so far it hasn't. Not a big deal as long as you know how to get it done. Now we're going to get out of here, and what I want to do now is I actually want to go on to my other server, which is called san.wiredbraincoffee.com, and let me show you how we're going to prepare the shared storage for this environment. On my SAN server, and you'll notice again it's called SAN, it's just a Windows Server 2012 server that we're going to use to install software on it that would allow me to do storage virtualization. Now, the software that I have chosen is StarWind, and that allows me to do a storage virtualization with iSCSI. You can do it with NAS. They have stuff that's specific to VMware and Hyper-V. There's an evaluation version out there that if you're trying to follow along and this is all you've got, this is your lab, then I invite you to go download it and you can follow along with what I'm doing. What we're going to do now, the process is going to be a little different depending on what you're doing and what type of storage, what type of SAN you have in your environment. So I've installed it. It's an eval version. Again, it works really well, and the thing that I like about it is that it has Microsoft's SMIS compatibility. So there's a module for SMIS which will allow us to get this private cloud thing off the ground, which is important if you're gonna, if you have a storage that you're following along, you want to make sure that it is, it's capable of SMIS. So I'm just gonna double click on the console here and get it started. Now, once we're in the console, see it has a very clean and nice interface. I'm just going to select my server here. We're going to right click on it and we're going to click on connect. It's going to go ahead and connect to the iSCSI SAN. So what am I doing in here? Well, we're doing a few things. In order for us to get clustering to work, we have to create a shared disk among all the hosts that are participating in that cluster known as the quorum disk, which is what we're going to create. It's typically a very small disk, very small LUN. I'm going to give it a gig in size. It could be much smaller than that, but I've got space, so I'm just going to give it a gig in size. But what you'll also notice is I've already created two other targets on this particular SAN. I have tier 1 and I have tier 2. Now, these are essentially what we're going to use again later on as we start to build our private cloud to distinguish between the different tiers of disk that we have. And what I'm creating with these target devices is again a target that I would allow all of my Hyper-V hosts to connect to as shared storage so that we can do things like live migration. Even though live migration doesn't require shared storage anymore with 2012, it's still faster and better and more, it's easier to do with shared storage when you have that central repository. But we need the shared storage to do a lot of other things, so I'm presenting these targets to my Hyper-V hosts. I've already created tier 1 and tier 2 as targets, and you'll see that these targets correlate to devices. So each one of these targets is going to connect to a particular device. Now, the important thing when you're looking at iSCSI in particular is the target name, the IQN name. This is something that, by default it's automatically created for you, and I'll show you here in just a second. If in your environment you need to change it, I'll also show you where you would want to change it. But you would want to, again, pay attention to the target name for each one of your targets so that as you're connecting your Hyper-V hosts, you're going to be needing those. So let's go ahead and create a new device. Let's go ahead and create the quorum device. I'm going to go ahead and right click on add device, and I'm just going to create a virtual disk. Now keep in mind your process might be different if you're not using this type of SAN. I'm going to click on next. We're just going to create a deduplicated disk here real quick. I'm going to create a new virtual disk, and then I'm going to give it a name and location. So I'm just going to go ahead and put it on the C drive, and I'm going to call it very simply quorum. Click on OK. I'm not going to change anything else. The size is just fine for me. It could be much smaller than 1 gig, but for now it's just going to be fine. We're going to click on next. I'm not going to create any kind of a replica, so I'm going to click on next. From a write back caching perspective, the defaults work just fine for me. Click on next. Again, this is where you have the option of creating a new target name, and we are going to do just that by creating the quorum target. Now keep in mind, if you wanted to change the IQN, this is where you would do that. Check this box, change the IQN to whatever standards that you guys have developed within your enterprise. Otherwise, keep this unchecked. Now the important thing here is you want to allow multiple concurrent iSCSI connections to this particular LUN. So you want to check this box, otherwise you won't be able to have multiple hosts connect to it. Click next to continue. We're going to click next one more time and then finish, and it finishes and adds the disk relatively quickly. Now once the disk is added, if you click on the targets node up here, you'll see that it already created a target for me as well. This brings us to the end of this lesson, so let's recap real quick what we've done, what we've learned. So we started off by talking about how we're going to prepare the Hyper-V host so that we can install the Hyper-V role and stuff like that. So we started by adding the two features that are required, the failover clustering feature and the multipath I/O. Now I also mentioned that the failover clustering feature is not really a requirement. You can wait until the next lesson when we're installing Virtual Machine Manager. It will automatically install that feature as a prerequisite when you're dragging and dropping your host into the cluster. But I wanted to show you what VMM was doing behind the covers, and as a result, we installed the failover cluster. We didn't really do anything with it, but we installed the feature. We also installed the multipath I/O, which will allow you to have more than one path to your storage. In this case, it'll be more than one path to my iSCSI storage, and these multiple paths can be in the form of, for instance, two interfaces, two NIC cards that are connecting to this shared storage. We then installed the Hyper-V role, and we went through and we configured it, we rebooted the server, and we brought it back up. Then we started to look at networking. I showed you the different network interfaces that I have configured. We had 4. I showed you that we split them off in virtual machine network for the virtual machines, for management, for storage, for cluster, and we took a look at the properties of each. We also then configured the storage, the iSCSI, using Starwind. We added a new quorum disk, and if you haven't done so yet, I would then invite you to also configure your tier 1 and tier 2 with whatever disk sizes that you have available to kind of mimic what we're trying to do. Now at this point, I want to invite you to replicate everything you've done on Hyper-V 1 on Hyper-V 2 and 3 in your lab if you have those hosts, so that you're up to speed, up to par with where I'm at today, right now, with my lab configuration. So I would invite you to pause the video, obviously, and then replicate this to your Hyper-V hosts. Finally, I hope this was very informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.